Good afternoon and welcome to the Workbench. Today I want to talk to you about some books that are over 100 years old and why you should definitely check them out if you're doing model railways or model engineering. So the two books I'm going to be referring to are Henry Greenlee's copies of Model Railways and Model Steam Locomotives. Now these are some very old books. The first edition of Model Railways was 1922, the first edition of this one was 1924. So they are definitely showing their age, and these are 1930s copies. So these books are 90 years old as well. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit, I'll show you some pictures, is the type of books that these are, and who Henry Greenlee was. He didn't invent model railways or model steam locomotives by any stretch, but he was the editor of the Model Engineer magazine. So at the time, there wasn't really any model railways, it was all model engineering. You typically modeled a locomotive and then you might have a track for it to run around on. And so he codified and standardized a lot of things that we as modelers and model engineers have taken for granted these days. And so looking back at these very early books is really useful, because what we return to the first principles of conceptually, at least, of what we're trying to achieve. So a great example of that is in the book Model Steam Locomotives. Henry Greenlee says, I haven't got the exact quote here, but essentially says, don't bother trying to slavishly copy every single aspect of the prototype, because it's a fool's errand. What you should be doing, or what he suggests you should be doing, is building a locomotive that's designed for work, and whatever that work is, make it appropriately specified. There was absolutely no reluctance if you needed to go freelance, or you needed to increase the loading gauge of the locomotive to make it physically larger on the same track, if it allowed it to pull a large number of passengers, or to be more efficient, or whatever the specific challenge might be. And that's really interesting. He also talks about things like on the wheels of driving wheels of a locomotive. There are on the wheel itself, where the coupling rod comes in, and the coupled wheels move around like this. Opposite that offset coupling rod boss, there's a balance weight which keeps the wheels concentrically balanced. And he's saying even in 7 1/4 inch gauge, which is huge, he's saying just you don't need to do that. You can do it if you want, but there's just no need. Why even bother? Why make life hard for yourself? Because there's the kinds of forces that are in play in model engineering mean that it's completely pointless and doesn't achieve anything. So why bother? Focus your energies elsewhere. Which is really interesting, because I've spent lots of time reading things like Model Railway Journal and focusing on the very, very minute aesthetic detail of locomotives and rolling stock and layouts and so on, and maybe getting lost a little in what I'm trying to achieve. And it's really interesting going back to these early books, where there is so much more focus on things like mechanical fidelity. So rather than aesthetic fidelity, we talk about using axle-driven pumps to pump lubricant, for example, or water. There's the idea of making a layout not so that it most closely represents a particular station, but which can functionally represent the things that happen at a station. And it's just, when these books were written, one of them was written before the grouping, before 1923. So things like the Southern Railway or LNER didn't even exist when this book was written. Modern era was pre-grouping, which we consider one of the earliest forms of modelling. And so it's just really great to get inside the head of someone who was around in that period, who's dealing with concerns and challenges that we either we don't think about anymore, or that we've put into different categories of concern. There's layout plans. There's the great thing which shows you efficient and inefficient sidings. Here, it's saying, don't try and do this. This is just a complete waste of time. or this one here. You can never get anything into this platform. It's just things that are, like I said, these first principles of railway design and model engineering that aren't retrospectively considered through a modern lens. And this is a really wonderful book about steam locomotives. It essentially says, if you're going to go from nothing, how you build it. And one of the most interesting things, I think, is a diagram like this, which shows you gauge 1, gauge 3, and then 3.5, 5.5, and 7.25? 15 inch gauge. And they really do consider the gauge 1 to be the smallest scale, and the O gauge it's a bit of a trivial, silly thing, a bit like we consider T gauge now. And here's an example of where he talks about using a different loading gauge or a different scale with the same gauge, and how that affects the dimensions of the model. Just really, really interesting stuff, and they're cheap, and you can read them. Have a cup of tea and sit in the garden and read them. They're absolutely fantastic books, and I really highly recommend them.